We're happy to welcome our friends from across campus from our co-sponsors at the Global Islamic Studies Center, the Center for Middle Eastern and North African Studies, the International Institute, and the Department of Asian Languages and Culture. We've been really pleased to have such great participation. While COVID has been a terrible experience throughout the world, we've been really happy that we've been able to expand across campus and across the world, and welcome those of you who we know are from outside the University of Michigan. Thank you for joining us. We also would like to acknowledge the U.S. Department of Education National Resource Center for their support in this seminar series and our center activities. And just as a reminder that we have one more CEAS lecture for the semester. And for those of you on campus, we've been so pleased with the turnout this year, that if there's anyone you'd like to see for next semester, we will be releasing our schedule soon and are happy to invite more people. It's been great that during COVID, we've still been able to have the participation and interest. And next month, we're really happy to have Hugh Fung, who is our lecturer right now at the University of Michigan for Southeast Asian Studies. We've had a great time interacting with her. She'll continue next semester teaching here as well. And her lecture title is, "What Kind of Ecological Culture Do We Need? Drought History and Lessons from Pre-Modern Southeast Asia." Please feel free to register. This is on Friday, December 4th, and we look forward to seeing you again. And today, I'm really pleased to welcome Dr. Nurfadzilah Yahaya, who is an assistant professor in the history department at the National University of Singapore. So she's visiting us in the middle of the night right now. And she is a legal historian of the Indian Ocean. Prior to that, she was an early career fellow in Islamic studies at Washington University in St. Louis. We're happy to have her here so we can congratulate her on her new book that was released in September 2020, Fluid Jurisdictions, Colonial Law and Arabs in Southeast Asia, which was published by the Cornell University Press. And we want to congratulate her on that accomplishment. She is a prolific publisher. Her articles have appeared in Law and History Review, Journal of Women's History, Indonesia and the Malay World, and Muslim World. She has also published a chapter in the Oxford Handbook of Jurisdiction in International Law. And with that, I'll ask her to begin her seminar. And again, please feel free throughout the talk to put your questions in the Q&A. If you could, we'd be happy if you would say your name and where you are from so we can share who you are with Professor Yahaya. So Professor, please, thank you.
Thank you very much, Laura, for the introduction, and Jessica for organizing my talk today at the Center for Southeast Asian Studies. In the period of high empire, Muslims never moved through the world as a unified, coherent whole, while clamoring for the application of Islamic law. The story that I tell is of the connections between colonial subjects and colonial governments, with its many echoes of patriarchy and overlaps in commercial interests. The story lies at a kind of confluence. Rather than tussles for supremacy in the colonial settings, or a story of direct inheritance of colonial laws post-independence. Rather than stand with fellow Muslim subjects who collectively formed the majority of the population in Southeast Asia, my historical actors, who originated from Hadramaut in present-day Yemen, allied with European colonial governments, paving the way for yet more colonial intrusion into the religious affairs of Muslim subjects. The organizing principle of my book is legal pluralism, which calls attention to the ways that laws and legal systems interact and remain in relation to one another over time. Colonial rule spawned possibilities for more power plays and to an extent renew the playing field of legal competition. The Arab elite ensured that close, often intimate contact with local populations in Southeast Asia led to an intensification of difference that generated new gradations of affinity based on rank, place of origin, and class. Gender became a larger barrier as women became absorbed into families, but remained constantly subordinated and now had to deal with colonial judges who were uncomfortable with the relative freedom of Muslim women to contract business relations on their own, marry on their own, marry of their own accord, and inherit property according to Islamic law. In my book, I examine the role of paper, which is a powerful conduit for the spread of jurisdictions in the late colonial period, compelling colonial authorities to recognize and heed the words of colonial subjects. The wealthy Arab elite harnessed colonial legal resources in the form of powers of attorney, infused with new British and Dutch legal idioms to manage their wealth across the Indian Ocean. Powers of attorney were inscribed with the authority of colonial governments, although colonial subjects might not necessarily accept their legitimacy over other areas of life. These powers of attorney were potent precisely because they had the power to generate and subsequently firm up jurisdictions. The wide proliferation of powers of attorney across the Indian Ocean likely contributed to the material infrastructure of colonial governments and perpetuated norms that eventually led to the expansion of colonial jurisdictions over time. Powers of attorney did not simply allow testators to leap across the ocean, they also enabled temporal leaps. They long outlasted the lifetimes of their testators by projecting meaning into the future, knitting past and future together. Detailed instructions in powers of attorney took for granted that property holdings would long remain in the hands of the family or the clan. Certainly, time moved more rapidly in the crowded, bustling cities of Southeast Asia than in Hadramaut, and long distances allowed some attorneys to be incompetent and corrupt for longer than they should have been. Undoubtedly, however, the numerous powers of attorney granted by Arabs in Hadramaut to their kin in Southeast Asia expanded their capacity for action by transcending jurisdictional and territorial boundaries and diffusing their responsibility considerably across the Indian Ocean. But the enforcement of these terms depended on the perpetuation of colonial jurisdictions invested by these powers of attorney. Paradoxically, each power of attorney acknowledges one's encumbrances across long distances only to cede one's authority momentarily or permanently. These powers of attorney carried the weight of obligations of Arabs towards each other over several generations and resolutely embedded these obligations in several locations. While the Arab diaspora aimed to surmount distance and blend jurisdictions, we need to remember that colonial regimes were built on evidence of rights to possession superior to whatever other contenders could muster in their bid to assert their own rights to possession. In the Netherlands Indies, Dutch colonial officials resented the transfer of property from natives to foreign orientals. Foreign orientals refer to included the Chinese, Japanese, and Arab populations. It is the transfer of property from natives to foreign orientals through the power of attorney was a very common way of paying debt by natives to foreign orientals who wanted to own land but were restricted from owning many kinds of property. This led to Dutch claims of illegal occupations by Arabs in the Netherlands Indies. The race-based legal system in the Netherlands Indies created much confusion because it was not actually race or ethnicity that determined the status of foreign orientals, but Dutch economic and political interests, which changed over time, so it was very unstable. While the personal laws of other foreign orientals, such as the Chinese and Japanese colonial subjects, were elaborated upon in detail in legislation, discussed extensively in colonial journals, even codified and grounded in statute to some extent, there was no attempt to elaborate upon laws pertaining to Arabs beyond general rules concerning travel restrictions and dress codes. Government officials claimed that there was no urgent need to do so since they were presumed to share laws with the native Muslims who formed the majority of the population after living among them for several generations. So at this time, the late 19th century onwards, until independence in 1945, the Arab population was about 5 to 7% of the entire colony, depending on where it is. So in Java, they were more 5%. In the outer islands outside of Java, they were 7%. Because the varied population and geographical landscape of the Netherlands Indies resisted the logic of a unified legal system, being an archipelago after all, Arabs in the colony had good reason to assume that they could continually negotiate their rights as colonial subjects in particular locations. In a way, the category of foreign orientals emerged as a form of quasi-sovereignty, albeit under colonial rule. The differentiation of colonial populations into three sections, natives, foreign orientals, and Europeans, gave rise to something that the Dutch call quasi-international privaatrecht, where each legal system meant for each group was attributed fictional territorial jurisdiction. The phenomenon fits what Lauren Benton describes as the emerging model of an international legal community composed of polities recognized as civilized by the societies already considered members of the international community during the 19th century. The fact that international law was invoked in cases involving natives, foreign orientals, and Europeans meant that a conflict of laws was inherent in every case involving parties in different colonial categories. This system is incongruous since international law could only be applied between nations. It certainly did not reach within states because that would violate a state's sovereignty. Moreover, the application of international law assumes that there are identifiable nations within the colony. On a superficial level, it flattered the Dutch colonial government to conceive of the population of the Netherlands Indies as a territorially compact people, rather than the sprawling and stratified colony that it was. An optimistic teleology would be that this so-called international system was the harbinger of its future implementation at some undefined time. It is easy, therefore, to imagine how some of the Arab elite in the Netherlands Indies were inspired to achieve actual quasi-sovereignty, a term that refers to the status of sub-polities within empire states that were said to retain some measure of authority over their own internal legal affairs while holding only limited capacity to form international relations. So some kind of capitulations, exemptions system. The First World War definitely formed a watershed moment in the history of British-Arab relations in the Middle East. If the end of the 19th century was high empire, the period of imperial rule from the First World War onwards could be termed covert empire, to borrow a term from Priya Satya. A complete redefinition of British counter-espionage networks occurred from 1914 to 1918, transforming the British intelligence system from a small, specialized system dedicated to the detection of German secret agents to a vast intelligence gathering network costing hundreds of thousands of pounds each year and collecting information on virtually anyone within their orbit suspected of being opposed to British government policy. Covert surveillance policies in Southeast Asia intensified and gained more momentum as Britain fought against the Ottomans during the First World War. British authorities were worried about the potential chaos that might emerge with the breakup of the Ottoman Empire, which was thought to hold the allegiance of a significant proportion of the Muslim world, including those in Southeast Asia. Arabs on both ends of the Indian Ocean tried to sway the direction of these policies to foster their own diverse agendas in Southeast Asia and Hadramaut. British consul in Batavia created the Index of Arabs, which I write about in chapter 5 of my book. What ultimately emerged in Southeast Asia was schemes based upon careful curation of information by various parties who positioned themselves as producers of authoritative knowledge amid the rapid shifts in global politics during the war. Things took a turn in February 1915 when several Muslim Rajput soldiers from the 5th Light Infantry stationed in Singapore rebelled after hearing rumors that they were to be sent to either Egypt or Gallipoli to combat fellow Muslims under Ottoman rule who were fighting against the British. 45 soldiers were sentenced to death by British authorities for rebelling, and the air was thick with tension between Muslim residents and the Europeans in colonial Singapore immediately afterwards. A resolution stating that, and I quote, "the loyalty and fealty of the Mohammedans of Singapore has in no whit altered from what it was before the war until the present," unquote, was passed and presented to the King of England via telegram on behalf of the entire Muslim community by two Arab leaders, Said Omar al-Sagaf and another prominent Arab, Said Muhammad bin Aqil. So it must be mentioned that the Arab population in Singapore at this time was 0.1% of the entire population. How did Arabs rise so easily to be the voice of Muslim authority despite being such a small minority? The question is linked to the politics of representation in the colony, where Muslims themselves, about 16% of the entire population, placed a high premium on ethnic diversity. The 1914 public endowment deed of a Waqf, WAQF, created by the Sultan of Johor, which lie on the Malay Peninsula, now part of Malaysia, demonstrate representational politics quite nicely. The Waqf was for the Sultan Mosque, the largest mosque in Singapore, established in 1824. And the Waqf deed manifestly stated that two representatives from each of the respective racial communities who worshipped at the mosque, namely the Malays, Javanese, Arabs, Bugis, North Indian community, and South Indian community, were to be appointed as trustees of this Waqf. The deed's overt acknowledgement of the mixed society residing in the area around the mosque did not reflect the racial proportion of Muslim communities in the area at all. There were certainly more Malays and Javanese compared to Arabs. The endowment deed prioritized diversity, but not proportion, in underscoring representation in leadership of the mosque. This arrangement was echoed in the leadership of the entire colony, where a minority within the larger Muslim community was able to dictate policy and influence colonial government. Remarkably, the Arab diaspora in Southeast Asia demarcated their own legal jurisdictions by anchoring their kinship obligations and commercial interests that they had developed over several centuries across the Indian Ocean. Two devices entrenched colonial jurisdictions, the first being the power of attorney, which I've already spoken about, and the second is the Waqf. While the Arab diaspora continually crossed oceans, its wealth lay primarily in immovable property by the early 20th century because it was durable, convertible, and universal, the very cloth from which capital is cut. The more wealth members of the diaspora accumulated in Southeast Asia, the more they needed to protect it. To ensure their wealth remained in their families for generations, they coded their property legally as a type of religious endowment known as a Waqf, thus insulating their assets from tax authorities and disintegration, and further enhancing their durability. In the eyes of colonial authorities, the Waqf was essentially a trust, a form of preemptive asset shielding, what Catherine Pistor calls one of the most ingenious modules for coding capital, deriving its utility from the blurring of distinction between contract and private law. The Waqf was simultaneously an apotheosis of Arab diaspora's efforts to settle in Southeast Asia and their eventual compromise with colonial authorities. Colonial administration of Waqfs represented the limits of the portability of Islamic law that the Arab diaspora relied on, although perhaps we should be more surprised that these Waqfs remained, albeit in distorted forms that conform to English common law trusts. Rather than use their colonial legislative fiat to declare Waqfs illegal, British judges chose to approve of Waqfs by using the Cypre doctrine, which approximates the testator's intentions as much as possible, as much as is allowed according to English common law, while directing the Waqf's funds to the nearest possible purpose. This approach granted colonial judges more power in the courtroom over Waqfs. So it depends on the judge very much. By the 1920s, more Waqfs were passed as charitable after Waqf deeds and testaments were carefully passed. In order to be allowed to exist, Waqfs had to prove that they were charitable, basically. The Waqfs had to be judged to be charitable. Family Waqfs, deemed private Waqfs, were accepted by judges with many caveats, limited to being temporal trusts. A Waqf, by definition, is forever. If it's not forever, it's not a Waqf anymore. So this basically became colonial Waqfs. Waqfs deemed private Waqfs were accepted with many caveats by British judges, limited to being temporal trusts now, while public Waqfs were constantly deemed charitable since they were beneficial to the colony. In the process, judges shifted Muslim charity towards public welfare and away from individual families and clans. Within the British Strait settlements of Penang, Malacca, and Singapore, the Arab elite expanded their reach and influence by acting as hosts and patrons through the establishment of Waqfs. In keeping with the common historical practice that has been going on for many centuries amongst wealthy Muslims throughout the world. Yet, Arab benefaction over other Muslim subjects in the colony made British authorities uncomfortable as well, as they were unwilling to share any kind of authority with colonial subjects who are not supposed to have patronage over other colonial subjects. Although Arab diaspora in Southeast Asia tried to use colonial law to ground their family and property lives in the region, colonial law had an imprisoning rather than an anchoring effect. The mobility of the members of the Arab diaspora who settled in Southeast Asia was a cosmopolitan Indian Ocean phenomenon, entangled in and transcending British and Dutch colonial worlds. What can diasporas teach us about the history of Southeast Asia as a region, dominated as it is by narratives of hospitality and receptiveness to other cultures and peoples? This phenomenon has been pointed out by historians of Southeast Asia, Josh Sedes, O.W. Walters, Harry Benda, John Schmale, and later historians such as Anthony Reid and Barbara Andaya. Southeast Asia, especially island Southeast Asia, that today encompasses the modern nation states of Malaysia, Brunei, Indonesia, and Singapore, is a region that was conducive to new influences and historically did not prioritize nativist narratives. This characteristic applies to the Indian Ocean as well. By the time they arrived in Southeast Asia, the Arab communities in the Indian Ocean were already diverse, and most had settled in places throughout the Indian Ocean, absorbed into local societies, while others stood out within their host societies, retaining their Arab identity to instrumentalize it in different ways and gain political and social privileges. In particular, the port cities of Southeast Asia were shaped to an unusual extent by mobility, and according to Amitav Ghosh, to be different in a world of differences is irrevocably to belong. Another thing that historians of Southeast Asia note is that maritime seas connect rather than separate. Historians of the Bay of Bengal, such as Sunil Amrith, are in fact driven by this motif in their work. While works in Southeast Asia have been linked to China over the past few decades, more historians of the region need to consider the area west of it too. Relatively speaking, histories of the Indian Ocean have gotten short shrift from historians who focus on the eastern end of the Indian Ocean. Although for the past 15 years, they have gotten more attention from historians such as Michael Lafan and Eric Taliakodzo. The area is also the focus of scholars of Islamic studies, anthropologists, political scientists, and comparative literature, of course. History, however, has something to offer in that we can trace and contextualize people's particular choices across time and space. The monsoonal wind system in the Indian Ocean was quite predictable. The predictability of a homeward wind made this ocean one of the world's most benign environments for long-range voyaging. In other words, the Indian Ocean loop of obligations is not new. Towards the end of the 19th century, closing the loop took on new forms, which I explore in my book. Rather than following the trajectory of Islam or Sufi orders or imperialism, we can closely follow the paths of actual people on the ground to see how they navigated changes in their everyday lives. Chances are we will see how their available options, even in the midst of colonial oppression, were not as polarized. It's not being pro versus anti-colonial or Southeast Asian Arab versus Hadrami or Middle Eastern Arab, Islamic versus non-Islamic, or British subject versus Dutch colonial subject, or speaking Javanese or Malay or Bugis versus speaking Arabic. They inhabited several cultures at once and did not necessarily approach the world in binary terms. A focus on personal jurisdictions rather than territorial jurisdictions tell a different story than most histories. Many Arab foreign Orientals tried to claim a European status through identifying as part of the Ottoman Empire in the second half of the 19th century. Since the heart of the empire, Istanbul, was in Europe, most Arabs in the Netherlands Indies were, of course, not from Baghdad or Turkey in the Ottoman Empire proper, but from Hadramaut, where Ottoman hold was actually tenuous. Although in 1872, the Ottoman Sultan did install a governor for the Hadrami coast. Hence, Dutch authorities believed that the claim of Ottoman subjecthood among Hadramis was weak. An Arab merchant from Baghdad, residing in Batavia in 1871, attempted to claim equal status with Europeans by referring to Staatsblad or Government Regulations 1864, number 179, which referenced a treaty between the Netherlands and the Ottomans, where the former had recognized the latter as European. Unfortunately for the Baghdadi merchant in the Netherlands Indies, Dutch courts ascertained that in the colony he was not a European but a foreign Oriental, just like other Arabs. In 1907, the identity of a man named Saleh Fagih presented a challenge to Dutch authorities. He was born in Makkah to parents who were Turks from Albania, with a grandfather who was Roman Catholic, though all the other members of his family were Muslims. Dutch authorities did not know how to classify him because of his lineage. Eventually, he was classified as Arab Turk and momentarily grouped with foreign Orientals, who happens to be his fellow litigants in this particular case. He appealed this classification, and the Supreme Court in Batavia subsequently declared him a European. The case was then brought to the Raad van Justitie in Bandung, in Java, rather than to the Landraad, which is a lower court, a mixed court, uh, meant only for natives and foreign Orientals, including Arabs. So he was under jurisdiction of a court meant for Europeans, basically. One of the main things that I continually grapple with is the term hybrid. The concept of hybridity assumes at least two identifiable strands woven together. The headline of a report in 1934, Arab or Native question mark, on the case of guardianship over a boy who was half Dutch, half Arab, in Meester Cornelis in Java, encapsulates the absurdity of legal racial separations. The boy's biological father had returned to Hadramaut and he was in the care of his Arab uncle on his father's side. Because racist ideas and practices were an insistent feature of colonial rule, not surprisingly, differences were emphasized in racial classifications over the past 200 years and weaponized against some people in subordinate positions. Colonial rulers continually yoked Arab identities to places outside of the region, outside of Southeast Asia, viewing them as hybrid, creole, or mixed, and sometimes even outright foreign, effectively uprooting their histories from the region. This is not how people lived. Most people did not view themselves as split in terms of family, law, religion, or ethnicity, but they do deploy racist colonial classifications when it suited them. Words like fractured I find to be inadequate due to negative connotations, however. They are mixed, of course, being part this and part that. They led lives in several places in a single lifetime. But I do not see them feeling or being unsettled or in limbo in any place until classified as such by colonial governments. Yet, despite all these troubles that they experience in terms of legal classification, especially in the Dutch colony, they still sound self-assured and plodded on. And this is I see in my sources, guarding their property rights and keeping their families intact. They learn how to forge the sort of new language that is necessary for a reinvented existence. Over time, as I said, they were made to feel increasingly unsettled, especially in Netherlands Indies, in the various ways that I mentioned. Choices could be made by the Arab diaspora still, despite this. So they could choose to move to another place if possible and stuff like that. Because usually theirs was not a case of forced migration in the first place. During the 19th century, links between homeland and destination faded into the background in the colonial period, as the diasporic elite remade their lives in Southeast Asia, often according to new colonial molds. The Arab diaspora deliberately chose to lean on bureaucratic infrastructure in their effort to construct new scales of responsibility, jurisdiction, and sovereignty. They paid a price for this. They put themselves in debt. They put themselves into the debt of European colonial governments. I suppose it is easy to romanticize the ocean and its attendant phenomena of diaspora, cosmopolitanism, and mobility, especially when they are artificially unmoored from the institutions of power and class domination. It is worth exploring whether members of the Arab diaspora were truly cosmopolitan, a mainstay of writing about diasporas. Through legal differentiation, colonialism heightened visibility of race and class, thus further widening rifts among people, as my book shows. My book is a story of the rise and fall of the Arab diaspora in the Indian Ocean, or conversely, a story of the rise of colonial port cities and the erosion of its cosmopolitan ideals. Colonial subjects and colonialists knew each other, went around and through each other. The contact between the colonialists and colonial subjects wasn't one-sided and didn't necessarily spell doom in the moment. There was constant room for negotiation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Yahaya, for the really great talk. We have some questions already coming in. And for everyone who is in the audience who would like to ask a question, again, the Q&A is available. And if you could please just note your name and where you are from. It was a great talk. So first we have a question from Marlon Salas, who's in the Department of Comparative Literature here at the University of Michigan. And he asks, I find it quite fascinating that the points Professor Yahaya has raised about how to world Southeast Asia alternatively, i.e. westward towards the Arab world, resonate with similar cause to world the region eastward, i.e. towards Latin America, particularly in the case of the Philippines. I wonder if she has encountered parallels between what was happening between the Arab diaspora in the Dutch and English-controlled areas of Southeast Asia and the Arab diaspora in the colonies under Spain and Portugal.
The biggest difference I see amongst the two groups is that the Arab population, the Arab diaspora in Southeast Asia was seen to be proponents of pan-Islamism, and because of frequent intermarriage with the Muslim colonial subjects in British territory and also in the Dutch territory, they were seen as a threat because of that. So they were seen as a Muslim threat, basically, to the colonialists. Yeah. So there was a main difference between the two groups. So they were not. So Islam is Muslims are. So they suffer from two kinds of racialization. One is that they were ethnically Arab, and secondly, they were generalized as Muslims also. And because they were seen as like the elite, the Muslim elite, so they were, secondly, they were racialized as Muslims as well and seen as a double threat because of that.
Great, thank you. So we have another question from Gregory Janney, who is from History, Southeast Asian Studies at Yale University. And he says, thank you for your talk, Professor Yahaya. In your research, I was wondering whether border and migration controls played a role in the movement of Arab, quote unquote, foreign Orientals between the Straits settlements and the Netherlands Indies. Besides colonial legal classification, I was wondering if the members of the Arab diaspora you studied also responded to or were managed by immigration bureaucracies or border controls.
Yes, they were very much controlled by, they were under constant surveillance by colonial officials who policed borders, movement across the Indian Ocean. It was part of surveillance of Arabs was already part of a larger surveillance project that lasted for several decades, from the 1860s until the Second World War, done by both British and Dutch colonial officials who looked very closely, who monitored the movements of Hajj pilgrims across the Indian Ocean. So all Muslim pilgrims who go for Hajj across the India, who travel for Hajj to Makkah, were already under surveillance. So the Arab population was under more surveillance, as far as I can see, more acute surveillance. It is very interesting, especially for the British in Singapore and Penang, because they were the, the most pilgrims in Southeast Asia, including the ones who are Dutch subjects, would travel across the Indian Ocean on British ships. So the British profited a lot from Hajj because they were the main. They owned the big shipping companies and responsible for traveling up to Hong Kong and also westward towards the Middle East. And so like clockwork, they know when to run these ships in order to facilitate the Hajj. So they were primed for surveillance, basically, in that sense, because these pilgrims were traveling on these ships. Interestingly, also, the British often had local partners. The British shipping companies had local partners, and the partners would be these Arabs themselves. So these Arabs were big shippers. They also owned they co-owned the shipping companies and sailing under the British flag. Yeah, so the British and Dutch hand in hand shared surveillance data with each other on pan-Islamism usually, and also because of they also shared quarantine facilities, because the quarantine is big business. Pilgrims had to pay for their own quarantine in Jeddah, where the embassies were, the consulates were, the British and the Dutch consulates, and the British were very much involved because they have so many Muslim subjects, because they ruled huge parts of the Indian subcontinent. And the second largest interested party is the Dutch, because they ruled over this huge colony in the Netherlands Indies. So Arab surveillance was a big deal, but it was also like folded under this larger surveillance of travel across the Indian Ocean. And usually it is the Hajj, because that's like the biggest event of the year. Yeah. And Eric Telecozo has shown how both the Chinese and the Arabs were racially profiled in the South China Sea as being people who are exploitative of Indonesians, of Siamese, of Vietnamese. Like these people are regarded as cunning, wily, and stuff like that by both the Dutch and the British, who are taking advantage of Southeast Asians. Yeah.
Oh, that was a great response. Okay, I'll move on, but thank you. That was great. So we have a question from Joanne Liao, who's an assistant professor at the University of Saskatchewan. She wanted to thank you for your talk and for sharing your fascinating research. And she'd like to hear you talk more about what you think are the implications of your research for the contemporary geopolitical and cultural reality in Southeast Asia. In particular, about the way you emphasize the idea of personal jurisdictions versus territorial jurisdictions. What can we learn from the historical period in question through this methodology?
So my research shows that the shift from personal jurisdiction, which is the more older kind of jurisdiction that's been around for thousands of years, the shift from that to territorial jurisdiction was not as neat as we think it was. There's this idea that the coming of the Europeans, they were like, okay, now, we're gonna institute a Westphalian view of jurisdiction. Is territorial. Once I own this piece of land, if you're on it, you abide by my law. You cannot bring your own law with your own person and stuff like that. That used to be the case in the past. So the shift was not as neat. So people could still do that. People could still say, well, I'm Arab and I pledge allegiance to the Ottoman Empire. So even though I've been living here for decades, maybe in Batavia or something, you should still recognize me as an Ottoman subject, and therefore I'm European. And the Dutch listened to it and be like, you made a good point there, and they considered it. And by and large, the trend was not to recognize. Over time, you can see that the judges tend to more increasingly judge against that. Like, no, you're Arab, you're a foreign oriental on Dutch soil, basically in Indonesian soil. So that kind of like the cleavage, right, between the borders, the firming out of borders was not a done deal, even up till like 1930s, because they still say things like, well, I'm not really a Dutch subject, even after the demise of the Ottoman Empire and stuff like that. And because I was born there and I was born in the Middle East when there was an Ottoman Empire and stuff like that. And I might be Albanian, and so I should be European and stuff like that. So so that sort of shift did not happen overnight, and a lot of people could still make a case for that law traveled with them. Yeah. And in terms of Islamic law, on in the British case, in the British territory, in terms of Islamic law, that's already like a law that travels with a person, because once a person, an Indian Muslim in Singapore is subjected to Islamic law automatically. So in that sense, there's already that law that the British recognize to be traveling with the person. They just assume that the person would want to follow Islamic law, which is also interesting in itself, because this Islamic law is foisted on people who are perceived to be Muslims. So even if they're not, even if they have left the faith and stuff like that, but because of how the British organize their colonial populations, they just assume it's like, oh, your name is Muslim, and so your forefathers, your ancestors were Muslims, so you are subjected to Islamic law. So in that sense, there's that kind of it's like the opposite, right? It's like the perverse application of law that follows you as a person, even though you might not want to. Yeah.
Oh, wow, that's really interesting. Theo Cyprus, who's our friend from the Midwest Institute, asked, how did the quote unquote powers of attorney, legal privilege by the Muslim quote unquote foreign Orientals, influence Muslim majority Southeast Asia countries today?
The power of attorney is such a general document. It's just a contract transferring power from one person to another, such that it doesn't really it didn't change anything about law of colonial subjects. In fact, as I said, it it is a it is almost like, you know, because of the legal accoutrement, you know, like stamps and invocations of colonial authority in the power of attorney itself that was produced during the colonial period. It deepened colonial hold in these places. It's like even someone living in Hadramaut, which was not under Dutch or British rule, recognized that, oh yeah, that place over there is under British or Dutch rule. And they actually compel these colonial rule officials to do their bidding. You know what I mean? So in that sense, it was just like it just deepened colonial jurisdictions even more. But in the sense of like having a more having more far-reaching consequences beyond that, I don't see it at all. Yeah, because it's such a general contract. Yeah.
And Tom Wagner, who's a retired geographer from Eastern Michigan here, um, to ask to what extent might Muslim social hierarchies affect the implementation of Southeast Arab legal structures or community laws?
So one uncomfortable part of the story that I tell is that there is a hierarchy. There was a hierarchy of amongst the Muslim populations, and the Arabs tried to be at the top. And frequently, especially in the British territory, they were, you know, and they at least in the beginning, you know, at least in the 1870s, 1880s, the British too recognized them as being the Muslim elite, you know, the one that they dealt with instead of the majority populations, which consisted, of course, of Malays and Javanese peoples as well. And they, you know, the British listened to the Arabs, at least in the beginning, when they requested for more British influence, control over Islamic law um, in the lives of Muslim subjects, and the British actually took it on. You know, even though they did not do so in British India. The British in British India did not do so, and at first the British officials in the Straits settlements, including Singapore, were nervous about it because they were like, well, you know, in terms of our hierarchy, British India is at the top, and yet they don't do it over there. So who are we to do it? But maybe because of the scale, because it's such a tiny colony, uh, they took it on in the end, or maybe they thought, you know, the Arabs were important allies, and it was worth it to keep them happy, maybe. So they did it in the end, and British judges started to rule over the lives of Muslims. So they rule over cases of inheritance, they rule over cases of divorce, and they rule over cases of paternity to do with inheritance and stuff like that. So that was not what the Arabs wanted. They wanted to be the ones to judge. They wanted their own muftis and their own qadis actually to gain ascendance, you know. So but then they quickly lost control within 10 years of the passing of the Muhammadan, which is 7 years of the passing of the Muhammadan marriage ordinance in 1880. It was passed, it was put in force in 1882, and by 1888, 1889, I no longer see Arab muftis being consulted, and the British judges took it upon themselves to judge 100% without any consultation from anybody. Yeah, so that wasn't what they wanted, but that's what they got in the end. They were like, okay, I'm gonna cut you out now. Even the British judges were like, okay, I'm gonna rule, and I don't need any help anymore. Yeah.
So that's a nice lead into question we have from Hugh Fong, who's here at the Michigan.
Mm-hmm.
And her students sometimes come to this, and she said that they're just beginning to study Southeast Asia. And she wanted to ask about what types of archives.
So my archives
What
are
types of
mostly,
I'm so sorry, my
Yeah.
internet just cut out. What kind of archives you use in your research, and what kind of sources that you use?
so my archives are in various places in Southeast Asia, Jakarta, Singapore, and Penang, and also Kuala Lumpur, and Malacca as well. And I also went to the colonial archives in Britain, in London, and British Library, and the KITLV in Leiden University. Now the holdings are in Leiden University, and also the National Archives in The Hague. So that's the archives that I visited in order to get the material for this book. The bulk of my materials are actually law reports gathered from all these places. So some of the law reports are published, especially the ones in the colonial archives, and some of the law reports are not published, especially in the Southeast Asia archives. They are like loose, and you have to. It's more of a challenge. It's more fun to look at those than the published ones. Of course, it's a lot more challenging. Yeah, so most of my sources are law reports. Secondly, also powers of attorney, obviously, also wills and land deeds, which are mostly Waqf deeds for my case. Yeah, endowment deeds.
So what role did language play in your sources, and what role did different languages play in jurisdiction?
So in the Netherlands, the sources are in multiple languages usually, several languages at the same time. Dutch, French, because the Dutch did not translate the Napoleonic Code into Dutch. There's no need because they all know French. So it's Dutch, French, Malay, Indonesian rather, a little bit of Javanese, but not often, and Arabic as well. So that was the range of languages for the Dutch colony, the Netherlands Indies. For the British colony is in Arabic, English, and Malay. Yeah. So all these sources, because especially if I find them in the colonial archives, they will be translated like that. So there will be like many layers of translation. So translation is a big theme in my book, because some of the translations can be quite, I'm sure you're not surprised, can be quite different. Yeah. From one another. Yeah.
Oh, that's what I was thinking.
In terms of
It would be
nuance.
incredibly complicated. Yeah, incredibly complicated. All right, I think those are all of our questions, and we're just about at 1 o'clock. So I wanted to thank you again, Professor Yahaya. This was really fascinating talk, and thank everybody in our audience for the really good questions and helpful questions, and hope to talk to you soon. So thank you, everyone.